The House today will be considering the National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA. The bill is responsible for funding all U.S. defense operations through 2022 and setting policy around that funding. According to policy analyst, co-founder of the Security Policy Reform Institute, and author of the Speaking Security newsletter, Stephen Semler, progressives should consider voting no on the legislation, saying it allocates a ridiculous $778 billion to the Pentagon for the fiscal year 2022. That's almost $40 billion more than 2021 and more than any other iteration of the bill in the last 8 years. Stephen Semler is here to expand on his piece. Welcome to Rising, Stephen.
Thanks for having me.
And so what happened to the $300 million a day that we were told we're going to save by leaving Afghanistan? That adds up pretty fast, $300 million every single day. Yet somehow the Pentagon says that it needs more money, and Democrats and Republicans in Congress are just happy to go along.
Yeah, certainly 300 million goes a long way, especially if it's on a per diem basis. The Biden administration essentially decided early on, even before Congress added their own $25 billion, that the military budget should increase rather than decrease from the Trump administration by about $12 billion. So the plan from the Biden administration was to set the tone early and say, look, we're not going to get a peace dividend out of this. We are going to reinvest this in not necessarily endless wars per se, but a sprawling collection of 800 military bases, spending that exceeds the next 10 countries combined. So there was no plan from the Biden administration, even from day one, to invest it back into the American people.
So, and it's also worth noting that we left about $80 billion in military equipment behind in Afghanistan, not an insignificant number. But let me ask you, I mean, you made the point that the defense budget in the U.S. is larger than many countries, but how do we compare to China, obviously our greatest geopolitical threat by most people's calculation?
We spend a lot more than China. By comparison, our militarized but non-military budget is higher than China's actual military budget, meaning that if you added the law enforcement components of DOJ and Department of Homeland Security and added how much state and local governments spend on police and corrections, that amount would exceed the $250 billion that China spent on its military last year. By comparison, the bill that's coming for Congress today is considering $778 billion. Of course, money goes different ways in both countries, but it's still sort of, it sets a framework where if we're worried about how much China is spending on our own, we should be setting terms with our own budget and communicating the fact that we're interested in that, and therefore we reduce it ourselves. Instead, we're essentially, by increasing the military budget close to $40 billion, America is back, but in the sense that we're back to starting an arms race with another major power.
Well, and I'm someone who I'm for a robust national defense and do think that we need to invest in next generation technologies, keeping up with China on things like hypersonics and growing a next generation naval fleet, but also understanding that there is absolutely money that can be cut from the Pentagon's budget. And we've had audits of the Pentagon that often don't yield much. And I remember there was one, I think, in the last few years that folks at the Pentagon were bragging about the $1 million that was saved in an audit, which is a rounding error in the defense budget. Where would you start taking money away in terms of the broader network of of funding our defense?
Probably start with the antiquated technologies. Listen, I'm very sympathetic to your position, as long as it's sort of enveloped in a larger strategy to lead the world in terms of the threat of climate change. But I would start by reducing the procurement budget. Procurement's a slice of the DoD budget, 20 to 30%, or 15 to like 25, I should say. But there's a lot of technologies in there that are not only antiquated, but are simply there just to enrich the CEOs and the bottom line of military contractors. Over half the military budget goes to private contractors. A lot of people don't really, cover that. They just assume it just goes to this black hole of the military. But since fiscal year 2001, by my calculations, 54% of military spending has gone to private sector contractors. And those contractors, in turn, lobby. Last year, the ranked in terms of lobbying expenditures, 5 of the top 20 companies were defense contractors. They also give a ton of money to campaign contributions. They fund think tanks. So, my interest in cutting the procurement account isn't just sort of this nature of, good stewardship of taxpayer dollars or whatever. I just don't believe that, private sector interests, especially military contractors who rely on rising military budgets, arms sales, should have any sort of say in terms of constructing the debate on how foreign policy is considered. And right now, that's what they do through their campaign contributions, through their lobbying, through their funding of think tanks.
And Stephen, the U.S. is still offering some type of assistance to Saudi Arabia in its ongoing war against Yemen. And there's an amendment that Ro Khanna and Jan Schakowsky, Pramila Jayapal are trying to attach to the NDAA that tries to target all the different ways that the Pentagon goes around restrictions on helping Saudi Arabia with its war on Yemen. What are the prospects for this Ro Khanna amendment?
I try to remain optimistic because, you follow this stuff closely for a while and cynicism just consumes you. But I think there's, growing public pressure on to kind of reconsider the U.S.-Saudi relationship. There's been attempts by Congress in the past to rein it in, but there's sort of a carve-out between this, arbitrary sort of strange distinction between offensive and defensive weapons, even though, Saudi considers the war a defensive war, even though it's striking targets in Yemen. I would say that the prospects of the amendment are, I think there's growing bipartisan support. At least, I don't know what chance it has of passing, but I know if Congress represented the interests of their constituents, public opinion is turning on a bipartisan level to reconsider the U.S.-Saudi relationship.
Well, it's an interesting point, and a discussion that we had yesterday on the program was talking about some of progressives in the House opposing the U.S. funding for Iron Dome, a defensive, obviously, missile defense capability system in Israel, but also speaking of Saudi Arabia, where they have U.S. Patriot batteries to help stop missiles that can come into their country, which we, as the U.S., have generally considered it within our security interests because of the threat of the Iranians. So how do you weigh just this notion that cutting funding into some of these different places where we have engagements that do serve a national interest for us, how do we meet our needs if we're just purely going to be kind of across the board from the progressive standpoint, withdrawing our funding from some of these different operations?
Well, I would say it comes down to credibility. And if the Biden administration is saying we have to center our foreign policy on human rights and that the U.S., our credibility depends on that, being consistent with it, then we have to apply the same human rights standards across the board regardless. And we have to urge our partners or official allies to cease what they're doing in terms of creating the problems that this military equipment purports to solve. Saudi Arabia is perpetuating humanitarian crisis in Yemen. Obviously, that's going to be met with some sort of resistance across the border. If, in the case of Israel, if you're conducting a colonial war of oppression against a sizable chunk of your population, there's going to be resistance. So, in terms of the U.S. culpability in it, I think we should take it seriously because, arms sales pretty much go through unless there's a specific congressional action to stop them. And as was the case with Saudi, there's, just a reconsideration of the American public seems to be awakening after 20 years of endless war that maybe we should start taking this, this sort of claim that's just become sort of a throwaway line about U.S.-centered human rights and start to take it seriously and start to see some material results out of it with this administration.
No, very interesting. Oh, sorry, real quick. Very interesting point. And it's something that I noticed Joe Biden said at the UN General Assembly just a couple days ago. He said, this is the first time in 20 years that I'm speaking to you that the U.S. isn't at war. He said that while we still have forces in Iraq for our enduring mission to defeat ISIS, 2 days later, we conducted an airstrike in Syria. As you mentioned, we're funding operations in Yemen. We have forces all over West Africa and different parts of the continent. So how is there actually a Democrat interest in drawing ourselves out of these prolonged engagements, or is it more of a press release of we got out of Afghanistan, therefore we've ended forever wars?
I would say more of the latter, just because, as you said, and I'm glad you brought that point up in the way that you did. I mean, we just sent another 2,000 troops to Iraq, and it was a rotating schedule, so it's not exactly like a 2,000 troop increase, but still, I mean, U.S. troops are there and they're essentially sitting ducks for rocket attacks. The Iraqi parliament has now twice voted for non-binding legislation to expel U.S. troops. So I think it's about time that, kind of we say to the Biden administration that, look, like, again, we're after credibility here. This isn't sort of just to score a victory for the party, but our goal should be to improve the lives of working class folks in the U.S. and abroad. And the best way to, protect our troops is not by launching airstrikes in their defense when they're abroad in Iraq or Syria, but to actually bring them home and listen to what the working class people want in those countries as well.
All right, well, Stephen, we'll be watching these votes in the House closely today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate the discussion.
Thank you.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.